Welcome back to another Kentucky Derby profile here on Racing Rundown. On today's video, we're going to be discussing Hit Show, winner of the Withers Stakes at Aqueduct and Wood Memorial runner-up going into the Kentucky Derby. This is a horse that has 5 starts to his career, a graded stakes win. So we will take a look at his efforts and get into the pros and cons for him. But before we get any further, I will mention there is a link in the description down below to the playlist for the Kentucky Derby profiles of 2023, so you can check those out and take a look at the other horses that we have as we progressively release these over the course of this upcoming week. So Hit Show, trained by Brad Cox. Manny Franco will presumably retain the mount going into the Kentucky Derby, and as I mentioned, he is a graded stakes winner, and he was a horse that I personally really liked going into his effort in the Wood Memorial. So he broke his maiden back in October at Keeneland going 7 furlongs, and while he broke his maiden going 7 furlongs, this is a horse that it was definitely always going to want to go longer. And he did get an opportunity to go longer. And it should be mentioned that when he ran fourth on the Stars of Tomorrow card in November at Churchill Downs, the same day that the Kentucky Jockey Club was run, he ran in a very salty allowance there, which was won by Confidence Game, who is in the Kentucky Derby, won the Rebel. Rocket Can, who is also in the Kentucky Derby, won the Holy Bull, and he was fourth in that race and beaten for third, albeit 6 lengths, by 10 days later. So some good back class from that salty allowance at Churchill Downs, and that is one of the pros that I put in for him. Then got the opportunity to move up in trip, one going a mile at Oaklawn. Well, actually didn't get the opportunity to move up at Oaklawn, but Brad Cox probably looked at the way that he's bred and saw the opportunity to move him up early, and I thought that the move up in trip early for him was something that suited him very well. He got the opportunity to run at 1 1/8 in the Withers, and he took that out. It was a very nice visual victory. It got a good number for a race of that time of year. For reference, the initial reading on the Withers last year for early voting was a 78. It was eventually bumped to an 87, but whichever one you choose to read, it was still better than the effort that early voting turned in last year. So for an early 1 1/8 race at that time of year, it was a good number for him, and I was optimistic about him going into the Wood Memorial. I didn't think that he was a complete lock, but I thought that he was going to improve further going into the Wood Memorial and that he would run a very strong race there. Now, I sort of softened on him going into the Wood Memorial, but I did pick him there. He did get buried out in post 13, though, in the Wood Memorial, and that was something that was an issue going into the race, but I'm not going to pin that as a reason as to why he lost the Wood Memorial. But it certainly is worth mentioning that he was buried out in that 13 post. But again, I go back to that Withers effort. This was a horse that was coming out of a 5-length victory. I thought Arctic Arrogance was a horse that was going to be a cinch to make the Kentucky Derby because he had been second in the Remsen, second to Jerome. I thought he was going to run in the Gotham and then also run in the Wood Memorial, so run in all 4 of those New York preps and pick up the points. Ultimately didn't run in the Gotham, and once he didn't run in the Gotham, I thought that prediction was not going to end up coming to fruition. But point being, I thought that Arctic Air, I probably, thinking back to it, overrated Arctic Arrogance a little bit in my mind, and the victory maybe was a little bit inflated by, there wasn't really a whole lot of talent underneath him. It was Arctic Arrogance was 6.25 lengths clear of the horses underneath of Hit Show there. So definitely softened on him going into the Wood Memorial, but I still liked him, and I thought that he had the potential to prove the, hopes that I had for him after he had won the Withers and in the early part of March. So then the Wood Memorial happens, and he loses to Lord Miles, the big long shot in that race, as a pretty well-backed favorite there. And it never really looked like there was a point that he was going to get by in the stretch. Now, there was an inquiry there, and it was not, no action was taken. And that was the correct decision, because Hit Show kind of was the reason as to why the inquiry happened in that race. And one of the big issues that I have with him coming out of the Wood Memorial is he was kind of laying all over the 2 horses. He was in between horses there. Lord Miles was on the inside. Dreamlike for Todd Pletcher was on the outside. And Hit Show was kind of laying on both of them. He made contact with both Lord Miles, and he was honestly bothering Dreamlike, I thought, significantly there. I didn't think it was enough to, I didn't think that they were going to make the change there, but he was kind of laying all over both of those horses, to use that phrase. So he was, more so than anything else, I think, beating himself in that spot. And that's certainly not something that I like to see for a horse that is almost certainly going to have to deal with tight quarters in the Kentucky Derby. If he's going to be coming down the stretch and surrounded by horses, and he's going to kind of just be content to be alongside them and, like I've been saying, lay on them in the stretch of the Kentucky Derby, that's certainly not something that I'm optimistic about. So that's one of my, I'm going to the cons right away, is he didn't really handle the close quarters well. And he also hung the entire stretch of the Wood Memorial. You watch the replay, and that's a horse that looks like he should be getting by in there, should be going by Lord Miles. And I want to also mention, Dreamlike was a maiden in that spot. Now, he was a well-backed maiden because he had some good backlash to him, but he was still a maiden. And he was a nose and a head away from being the winner of the Wood Memorial. So that certainly reflects poorly on Hit Show, his inability to put away a horse that was a horse that was not a winner going in that race, and it's still a maiden. And then Lord Miles, who was coming out of a couple of very subpar efforts at Gulfstream and Tampa. So that's the biggest issue that I have for him. And then, so the hanging in the Wood Memorial, and then the way that he handled the close quarters. And he also doesn't really separate on a speed figure basis. You look at the 93 in the Wood Memorial, certainly the 91 from the Withers was a big step up from the allowance race that he had at Oaklawn. But given the progression that you saw from some of the other horses on the trail, you certainly would have liked to have seen him, improve much further than the 2 points. He did improve 2 points, but that's a marginal improvement when you compare it to horses like a Tappet Trice or even a Disarm or some of the other maybe lesser horses in this Kentucky Derby. So Hit Show has some positives to him, but the positives were there before the Wood Memorial. And since the Wood Memorial has happened, I have pretty much lost all positive thoughts that I could have for Hit Show. But we will get to the pros for him. And you can kind of excuse the Wood Memorial because he didn't have a great start there. And he did have to steady. And if you want to take the point of Lord Miles initiated the contact, and by Lord Miles initiating the contact, he kind of screwed with Hit Show's mental dynamic in that race, and that led to Hit Show kind of acting the way that he did in the stretch. If you want to take that viewpoint, I don't think that that's an incorrect viewpoint to take, so you can kind of excuse the Wood Memorial if you want to view it from that perspective. I'm not sure that I'm going to view it from that perspective, but if you're looking for a pro for him, that's something that you can think about. Then his win in the Withers. I already talked about how it was maybe inflated, but that being said, it was still a very nice effort for him. A 5-length victory in a stakes race. The 91 figure for that time of year was a good number. It was enough for me to look at him and say, okay, this is a horse that I think could potentially be a serious Kentucky Derby contender. So if he improves off of that number the way that I would have expected / hoped him to improve in the Wood Memorial, in the Kentucky Derby, then it might make him a player. And then he ran in that salty Churchill Downs allowance. And I talked about it with Two Phils. I think it's important for horses to get runs over the surface at Churchill Downs. He didn't win in that race, but there were good horses in there. Confidence Game and Rocket Can are both in the Kentucky Derby. So there are reasons to like Hit Show. I've seen some people on social media be very adamant for him. I liked, full disclosure, I liked him a lot more in March than I like him today in April, a week away from May. But he's not without a chance, and as I said, I can make the case for him if you want to take the point that Lord Miles contacted him first, and once Lord Miles contacted him, it kind of started a cascade with him mentally, and he kind of ended up screwing around in there. Then maybe you can view it that way. It's personally not the way that I'm going to do it. Hit Show is most likely not going to be for me, but and the other thing, he's probably also going to need a pace in this year's Kentucky Derby. I didn't mention that. I didn't want to put it down there because It's not really I have more cons for him, but he's probably going to need a pace. And as of right now, it doesn't really look like there's going to be a whole lot of early foot in this Kentucky Derby. So there are certainly horses that I like more than Hit Show, but I can see the case being made for him. I'm just probably not going to make that case. So that being said, that's it for this Kentucky Derby profile. We will see you next time. Be sure to check out the playlist below for the other Kentucky Derby profiles, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one.